Hi everybody! So today I'm going to be doing something a little different. I'm going to be reacting to a video called Top 10 Infallible Proofs That God Exists. Now right off the top, that's just kind of a strange word choice, right? Also, this is kind of a smaller channel. It only has 132 subscribers, and I wouldn't have probably found this if not for another channel called The Rabid Atheist who did a response to it. So go check him out. He's a pretty cool guy. He's not as rabid as his name might sound. He's actually pretty chill, has some pretty good responses. So I'd suggest just taking a look at his stuff, seeing if you like it. Now, one thing that's going to be a little different is I'm going to be doing an off-the-cuff reaction to these videos rather than a full scripted response. Hey, this is me shortly after reacting to all 10 of the infallible arguments for God. After doing my reactions, I thought I should add a little bit more. So one of the arguments I'm going to expound upon because it's one that you don't see very often. You'll know it when you get to it. Also, I just thought it would be fun to do a parody of this list. So I'm going to make my own just to have a little bit of fun with it. So most of this is just me reacting. It's a little bit more off the cuff, but I threw in a little bit more produced content for you. It is just going to be a regular Prophet of Zod extravaganza. Lots going on today. Hope you enjoy it. Also, one more thing, just purely out of curiosity, I thought this was funny. I wanted to take a look at this channel. The site got my attention because it's just called 10 Most. So I thought, what kind of channel is this? Is this a Christian channel? Not much in its branding suggested it. It seems like they just did random top 10 lists and weren't any kind of religious or Christian channel at all, and then took a turn at the video we're about to watch today. After that, suddenly everything is about Jesus and Trump, unfortunately. So, I guess that's what this channel is. There's this weird comment, too, that makes it clear that this is not just a secular channel that happened to do a video about Jesus at some point. I want to read that for you. As misguided and angry as you are with your Creator, He loves you and extends His hand of mercy toward you. Please accept Him before it's too late. Another thing, in your body there are systems. Those systems didn't create themselves. All the systems in your body works together to help you to live. A little bit of verb tense confusion there, but whatever. If one of those systems is out of whack, you begin to die slowly because you need all of them to work to truly live. This is the same for all living creatures. Just the fact that there are systems that cause us to operate proves that there is a God. Anyway, I think you get that. He goes into a lot of standard things about the design argument and finishes with Jesus is Lord whether you accept Him or not. Cheers. So, whatever. It makes him sound like he's a little bit of a Christian crank who's angry at some of the comments he was getting. You know what's coming now. I've told you a little bit of what you're going to see in this video. I hope you enjoy all the content. Have a good day. Roll the intro.
Welcome to our channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most profound questions humanity has ever asked. Does God exist? While beliefs vary widely, many argue that there are compelling reasons to believe in a higher power. Here are the top 10 infallible proofs that God exists.
Okay, so one thing that just jumps right out and grabs you is this is a weirdly dramatic voice, right? I do not think a brand new YouTuber with 100-some subscribers is articulating this way or has this kind of voice. It is suspiciously, dramatic or familiar. I think this is it sounds a lot like a trailer narration voice. In fact, actually, you know what? This is, I'm pretty sure this is the Honest Trailer guy. I think they are doing an AI recreation of the Honest Trailer voice. We'll listen to it some more and see, but I'm 90% sure that's what they're doing. This is a strange choice. I guess if you're just not good at narrating or you're lazy and want your way around it, maybe using an AI is the way to go. Kind of strange. And I don't know. In an ironic way, it makes it sound kind of cheap or weird. Also, is the question of God a profound question? People like to say that a lot, and I just don't think it is. I guess it's meaningful if God exists and the world is a much different place than it is otherwise, but it's just a factual question. He exists or he doesn't, and this is all based on whether there's evidence. A question that's profound is like kind of a mind blower, or I don't know, maybe a little more subtle than that. I don't know. It's kind of weird. Let's move on to this list, though.
At number 10, we have the fine-tuning of the universe. The precise constants and quantities in our cosmos, such as the gravitational constant and the speed of light, are so finely tuned that even a slight variation could make life impossible. This precision suggests the work of an intelligent designer.
Okay, so we are straight to the fine-tuning argument, which I guess no surprise that it's on this list. I think we all saw that coming. On any list of arguments for God, which again are probably all going to be pedestrian things we've heard 1,000 times, we know fine-tuning is going to be on there. If there's anything weird, it's that this is number 10. I would think it would be like up near the top, if not number 1, assuming this is a rank list. I'm not 100% sure about that, I guess. But I don't know. Fine-tuning is what it is. So what do we say about this? I've done a few videos about the fine-tuning argument. A lot of people find it compelling. I find it pretty weird for a few reasons. First, when it comes to tuning, this guy hits heavily on the idea that the constants of the universe are all tuned a certain way. How do you know that? How do you know those constants could be any different? You speak as if there's some little dial that you turn to make them whatever they are, and that God turns it, and if he's not turning it, they had to have been turned at random, and that indicates a designer. How do you know there's anything like that, if not a physical dial, like anything that can adjust these constants? And if they aren't there, what does it mean for the universe to be tuned? Also, I think he does the thing about life being impossible in a different type of universe. Let me look exactly what he says. I have his transcript in front of me. Even a slight variation could make life impossible. That would just make our life impossible, right? If the constants of the universe could have been changed and life developed, it would just be a different kind of life that was suited to that kind of universe. I think we get all that. Also, of course, 99.99999% of the universe is fatal for life like us to live in. We've all heard those kinds of things before. Also, one big question that I don't think people consider enough is if we're talking about the current Christian idea of God, meaning an eternal God who created every single thing about the universe, designed it from the ground up, is why did he have to tune the universe to support us? He didn't have to make us with the weaknesses we have. So why did he create us to require food, to require oxygen, to require water, all these kinds of things, to require certain temperatures, and then make the universe to support us? He didn't have to design us with those weaknesses. So basically, he created the problem and then created the solution. It's kind of incoherent when you think about it. Anyway, let's see what he has coming up next.
Coming in at number 9 is the complexity of life. The intricate details of biological systems, from the DNA double helix to the functionality of cells, point towards intelligent design. The idea that such complexity arose purely by chance is a significant leap.
Okay, so we are still in really standard territory, painfully standard, but maybe in a way that's a good thing. You know, if this list is saying something so typical, maybe these are the kinds of typical things that you're just going to see a random Christian pop off to you. So maybe knowing how right off the cuff to say something about it is a good thing. Most obvious wrong thing about this is I think he says that saying that life as we knew it arose randomly is a significant leap. Nobody says that life arose randomly. There is such a thing as a non-random natural process. So this whole dichotomy between it just is purely random roll of the dice versus somebody consciously designed it is totally fallacious. There are non-random things that happen in nature, and as any evolutionary biologist will tell you, this includes evolution. There are guided processes. I don't even know if guided is the right word, but there are non-random processes behind evolution. So this is just kind of a non-starter as far as the argument goes anyway. Also, the fact that we perceive things as complex doesn't mean that there's anything so inherently fundamentally complex about it. I might be wrong in how I'm phrasing that, but a lot of this is our perception. The fact that we as beings look down at the components of how we work, of what produced us, and see what we perceive as complexity, something about it feels a little irrelevant to me. At the very least, it is a bit of a mystery. It's, just something about our world and about ourselves that we are baffled by or have questions about. And just deducing our way from that to this God that we can't otherwise perceive, that we can't perceive at all, there's something just inherently fallacious about that. It's a clear God of the gaps argument. You don't know why we're a certain way, therefore God must exist. So, I don't know. Kind of useless. I have a feeling I'm going to be seeing a lot of arguments that I've encountered 1,000 times before, not articulated in any kind of original way. but let's see.
Number 8 is the moral argument. The existence of objective moral values, such as the inherent wrongness of murder and the virtue of love, suggests a moral lawgiver. Without a higher power, these values would be subjective and relative.
Moral argument. Boy, I have a complex relationship with this one. In fact, this relationship is so complex, it must be designed. Ha 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 ha! All right. Okay, so first off, if you hear this argument at least articulated this way, it means you're probably not speaking to a random churchgoer. The person you're talking to is probably familiar with William Lane Craig. If he says a moral law suggests a moral lawgiver, or at least he's heard those arguments secondhand. I don't know, the person is probably immersed in some kind of apologetics. A standard person straight out of the pew who doesn't engage with this stuff much would probably just say, how is anything right without God? I don't know. Does that really matter? I'm not sure. A few things to be said of this without diving too deep into it. I've done the moral argument a lot. So I guess the challenge is where to even begin with this. Morality is something that you feel very intensely, but it's complicated enough that having a real serious conversation about it with the average person is difficult. I would start by saying, like many people do, that values aren't totally universal across cultures. Different cultures and different people have some slightly different views of morality. Morality has also evolved some over time. But many cultures do share a lot of the same values. When they do, I think they're basically, for the most part, values that, one, are probably rooted in our instinct of empathy, at least for the people immediately surrounding us. But then also, to some extent, we need some base moral values just to survive. For example, if there were a culture that thought it was just cool to run around randomly killing people or stealing from them or whatever, that culture just wouldn't be around anymore. It would eat itself up probably. So largely what we see as morality is just a form of cooperation that serves as a skill to keep a civilization afloat. So if you didn't have an understanding among your people that you shouldn't murder each other, that you can't just take each other's stuff at random, that culture wouldn't survive just as surely as if it hadn't developed a skill of building a fire or farming or whatever. So I guess when it comes down to it, one thing I might ask an apologist is, if the universal skill of farming isn't proof for God, how is the universal skill of cooperating in a way that manifests in what we call morals proof for God? No civilization could survive without either, and we see how they're just needed skills. So how does it mean that God exists? So that accounts for a lot of the really obvious morals, but what about some of the more nuanced ones? How do we work toward those? And usually you work toward those just by figuring out what makes for a good social contract. What helps humans get along in a constructive society and show some basic regard for each other? Those questions aren't always easy, but you work toward them with those goals in mind. It's all about relationships between people. So it doesn't really seem to have much to do with a God. And in fact, somebody stepping into that conversation and instead of figuring out what helps humans cooperate, trying to assert what a God wants, that is such a useless part of that conversation that I think it kind of belies the whole idea that God gave us morals or that morals have anything to do with God. The whole concept just seems extraneous to the idea of morality. Also, this thing about a moral lawgiver, that's purely a play on words. There is no moral law in any universal sense, and no code had to be given to us by anybody. You're just using that as a metaphor for our personal understanding of how to behave toward others, and then extending that metaphor into a place it doesn't belong. It's just kind of nonsense.
At number 7, we have the argument from consciousness. Human consciousness and self-awareness are profound mysteries. The ability to think, reason, and feel points towards a higher, conscious source.
Okay, so consciousness, huh? Consciousness is kind of a tricky animal because you can kind of explain it to some extent, at least on a technical level. You can comprehend how nerve endings and eventually a brain becomes complicated enough that it could generate what we think of as thoughts and then a consciousness. But it's hard to fully get your head around, and to some extent, it's just always going to feel mysterious to us. And I think that's why I've always thought consciousness is going to be one of the last bastions of apologetics. It's something you can't fully understand. I don't know, the fact that you sit in your own head is just kind of strange. The fact that there's something ethereal swimming up there. Even when I think about it now, it starts to feel weird to me. So it's hard to fully give somebody an answer that feels totally satisfactory, probably. But one thing you can point out is this is kind of a counterproductive argument. For one thing, he said it's a mystery, right? So is it a mystery or is it God? Do you not know? And if you don't know, how do you know it's God? I guess would be one way of putting it. Or another way of putting it is, if the whole problem is that this is a mystery, then are you just admitting that every time you run to something mysterious, you just assume it's God? Basically, are you just throwing God of the gaps arguments at us? That in and of itself kind of kills this. Also, there's a little bit of a special pleading thing to this, because is God's consciousness mysterious? If not, why is our consciousness mysterious? And if so, do you need to explain the mystery of his consciousness by somebody who designed it? Maybe consciousness can just be there and we don't have to explain it. This just seems like a classic example of punting a problem that feels a little difficult up to God and pretending it went away, even though if you logically continue to apply it, consistently, it would present problems for the existence of God as much as it presents problems for the existence of us. Or not problems, but at least questions about it, Anyway, you get what I mean. Let's go on.
Number 6 is the historical evidence for Jesus Christ. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus are well-documented historical events. The impact of his life on the world and the transformation of his followers add weight to the claim of his divine nature.
So this is a big animal with a lot to unpack. The question of whether there was a historical Jesus, it's tricky because there's a lot of things that could mean and a lot of ways that they could apply to the Christian argument. This is also something where you could run afoul of other atheists or fall into distracting conversations about whether there was a historical Jesus, and I don't think that's a meaningful or even very coherent question. You can watch my video about that if you're curious why I say that. But I don't know, to address this guy threw a lot in here, and so actually I want to go back and watch it and answer it in a couple parts just so I can be more specific.
The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus are well-documented historical events.
So there's something tricky in this first part, which is that they say the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus are well-documented historical events. Number one, those kind of all beg to be broken down and addressed individually. I'll get to that in just a second. But this could mean a few things. Number one is that there is some kind of historical consensus that there was an actual historical Jesus. I'm willing to just take that for what it is, and maybe there was some dude. It also could mean that there are a lot of copies of the New Testament, which I find irrelevant. Almost all those copies were made hundreds, if not thousands of years after the life of Jesus. And so all that means is that basically the Christian church did the ancient version of photocopying, or the medieval version of photocopying, whatever. Neither of those gets us anywhere near an actual miraculous Jesus or godlike Jesus. One just means there might have been some version of some dude who Jesus was based on, or multiple dudes. It could just be the trend of apocalyptic preachers at the time. The other ones just mean that Christians copied a lot of their stories. Now, does this mean that the death and resurrection of Jesus are well-attested historical events? Death, I would say no. Aside from the fact that it seems like there was a Jesus, we know very little specifically about him. I think all we have is that there was some seed of a person at the core of the Christian religion. So I don't know that even the people who agree, the historians who agree that there was a historical Jesus, I don't think they agree a lot about his life or any specifics. Historically speaking, if he were to have died, he probably would have been thrown into a mass grave. But let's set that aside. Even if Jesus had died, which he did die sometime, let's just say he was executed. What does that mean to us? Very little, if anything, in terms of this debate. So then we're left with the resurrection. Is that documented at all? Jeez. In terms of anything meaningful to a historian, I don't think that was documented well. I would not call it a documented historical fact. It is a story in Christian tradition. I think maybe one of the early ancient historians alludes to it, but it sounds like he's alluding to what Christians believe more than anything, and it was just a simple statement made about 100 years after Christ. Almost everything we have about Jesus rising from the dead, or really anything about his life at all, is from the Gospels. So what does that mean to us other than the fact that there was a religion that wrote about Jesus? It's pretty meaningless. In general, I think this is just one of those things that Christians hear from other Christians or from pastors, and they just take it for granted. And then if they just assert it to you as a fact, they think that it counts in an argument when it really doesn't. So I think maybe asking a few more specific questions might at least articulate your position to a Christian, hopefully get them to think a little bit more about this.
The impact of his life on the world and the transformation of his followers add weight to the claim of his divine nature.
Okay, so on the second part, we go from there having been supposedly a historical Jesus to arguments for why this Jesus had to have been some kind of God or miraculous figure of some kind or another. Essentially, there are two parts to it. One, he transformed the world, and two, he transformed his disciples' lives. Transforming the world, I don't know that Jesus did transform the world in any demonstrable way. What we have is Christianity having transformed the world. You know, it became popular, got a little powerful, and then people who colonized the world took Christianity with it. So, did Jesus impact the world, or did a very powerful religion impact the world? I don't know that we can prove one way or the other. In fact, if most of what happened in terms of the impact of Jesus/Christianity happened after his death, how do you even distinguish between the two? So really all we have is really all we have is evidence that Christianity became a powerful religion. We know that. Thank you. The other part is his disciples. This is a complete non-starter. His disciples were transformed. Their lives were transformed in the Bible or in other stories from Christian tradition. So do I care? No. Do I care if your stories say that the disciples all were amazingly transformed by Jesus? I care about that as much as I care about the Bible saying that Jesus, died on the cross and rose again. They're all part of stories. I've said this before in one of my old Prophet Azad Explains Things to Babies video, saying that if Jesus hadn't really raised from the dead, why would the disciples die for a lie, or why would they be transformed? That's like saying, if the pigs hadn't built houses, why would the wolf try so hard to blow it down? All this argument is doing is using one part of a story to explain another part of the story. If you don't believe the story, it's meaningless. So not a lot here. The only thing we have that's even close to an argument is the influence of Christianity on the world. That's naturally explainable.
At number 5, fulfilled prophecies in religious texts offer compelling evidence. Many events foretold in these scriptures have come to pass, suggesting divine foreknowledge.
So prophecies, huh? I guess if we're going to keep being basic, why not just go straight down that path of arguments we've heard 100 times and knew we were going to hear here? So what do you say to this? I don't know. This is one of those ones that, like the life of Jesus, Christians just take it for granted without thinking a lot about it. They just hear that the Bible has a lot of prophecies that came true, and they just take it as factual or axiomatic and just come at you saying, if God didn't exist, then why did so many prophecies come true? So what do you do when they do that? I guess first maybe I'd ask for examples. I'm pretty sure there are only a couple possibilities. One is real world examples that happened. And so most of these, I think, are going to be either extremely vague, along the lines of Nostradamus. It requires a lot of interpretation after the fact. These aren't predictions, they're postdictions. Ask yourself, and maybe ask that person, would somebody in ancient Israel who heard this prophecy really think that all this stuff in detail was going to happen based on the wording of that prophecy? Or is it something that you can only interpret when you saw those events unfold and you connect them back to the Bible? Also, a lot of these simply depend on very unconventional dating of certain Bible writings. Daniel, for example, is a very good example of this. The author of Daniel prophesied a lot of things that had already happened, but they claim that those books were written before those events. Even those were written in a really cryptic way. Christians have to argue when you're talking about the statue with like the head of gold, the legs of iron, and all that kind of stuff. Christians often argue or have different interpretations of what those mean. So, if Christians can't even get it straight after the fact, how was anybody supposed to take anything from it beforehand? And if they couldn't, how is it meaningful prophecy? Biggest thing about it, I think one of the things Christians are going to say most is that Jesus fulfilled a lot of prophecies in the Old Testament. And this is one of the most demonstrably, utterly meaningless statements a person could make. Why? And I guess a lot of you probably know this already. But the people who wrote the Gospels about the stories about Jesus, the Gospels, they had access to the Old Testament. They were aware of these prophecies. So Jesus fulfilling prophecies is as simple as the people writing stories about him being aware of those prophecies and writing that he fulfilled them. This isn't difficult stuff at all.
Number 4 is the argument from design. The complexity and order of the universe, from the laws of physics to the beauty of nature, point towards an intelligent designer. The intricate design in nature is often mirrored in human creations, which are products of intelligent minds.
So the design of the universe is number 4. I'm a little confused because honestly, I remember seeing the design argument at number 10 and thinking, why did they get to this already? So they're just repeating it. I'm going to take a second and go back and just make sure I'm not going crazy here.
Coming in at number 9 is the complexity of life. Number 10, we have the fine-tuning of the universe.
Okay, so I'm not going crazy, but maybe they aren't technically repeating themselves. I don't know. Number 10 was about the fine-tuning of the universe. Number 9 was about the design of people. Now number 4 is about the design of the universe. This feels like a lot of making the same argument in slightly different words or articulating different parts of it. So you're really trying to stretch out your list of 10 arguments there, aren't you, buddy? I don't know. Is the universe being tuned different from it being designed anyway? I don't know. I kind of take this as the same thing. Maybe they're not technically, but they're kind of getting at the same point. But I guess one different thing he brings up here is the beauty of the universe. And what does that tell us? I don't know. If the universe is beautiful, that's just an attribute of the universe. How does the universe having an attribute such as beauty, or I think he also mentions complexity and the laws of physics, which is just how the universe operates, how does that point to the existence of something other than the universe? I don't know. Apologetics is very unique in that it uses the attributes of something to argue for something else, which I guess could work sometimes, but this is just like wild, unhinged, God of the gaps arguments. I don't know. You're drawing a lot of conclusions from the fact that the universe is a certain way. Why does something being beautiful mean that it has to be designed? He mentions also nature being mirrored by human creations. I guess that can be true, but all that means is that we as humans gain inspiration from nature and mimic it, or we try to build things out of, natural components. Extrapolating from the fact that we as these contained brains have this relationship with the universe and then kind of turning that on its head and suggesting that thus some bigger projection of our brains that doesn't even have a body had to be over the universe. I think it's just a lot of philosophical or perceptual confusion, all directed by the fact that people want to argue their way to God. I don't know. It's weird, but we've been through this pretty much 3 times, and I feel like we're belaboring if we go too much further. Maybe I've already belabored it.
At number 3, personal experiences of the divine play a significant role. Millions of people across cultures and history report encounters with a higher power, suggesting a universal truth.
So this is a really weird argument to bring up because we know that this happens. All of us, including atheists, know that people around the world have what they consider spiritual experiences or an encounter with the divine, or I think he calls it encounter with a higher power. We know this. This is the basis for the whole atheist-theist discussion. People are having these experiences. I've had these experiences as a former Christian, and the whole question is, how do you interpret it? Ugh, bumped my table. Oops. So, I don't know. How do you just bring up the fact that people have these experiences that we all have questions about and are trying to get to the bottom of? Therefore, it's an indication that there's a higher power. What are these experiences? Number 1, how do you know it's an encounter with a higher power? That's a pretty darn big question, right? Do you see a higher power show up? Do you see God stand in people's presence? Do you see any indication of that thing? Or are people just experiencing a sense of peace? Are they experiencing an emotion in a response to arousing music, to a crowd dynamic? Does the fact that these experiences are generated in the same way in religious settings as in non-religious settings? Does it bring up any questions is what I meant to say. People can meditate in a secular way and get a lot of the same feelings or benefits that come from prayer. You can go to the concert and have roughly the same You can go to a concert and have roughly the same experience that a Christian has in church. A lot of open questions there. And I think the answer to most of those questions, once you drill into it, tends to point to a secular answer, if anything. There's one thing here that's especially bizarre, though, is that he appeals to the fact that religions all around the world have these experiences. And let me look at his exact wording on the transcript. Millions of people across cultures and histories report encounters with a higher power, suggesting a universal truth. So I guess he's trying to say there's some kind of truth behind this. But if there's some truth, some core truth at the center of all this stuff, people are getting something right, but aren't they getting a lot of things wrong? I think most Christians would argue that most religions around the world are getting things drastically wrong to the point that they're unsaved and Christians need to come evangelize to them, right? So if they can have these experiences and misinterpret them in all these various ways, why is this one core truth not something they're also misinterpreting? Isn't that a possibility? And if all these quote unquote false religions are misinterpreting some of their spiritual experiences, and that might include the core experiences, maybe you, Christian, are also interpreting these experiences. Kind of a good thing to think about, isn't it?
Number 2 is the cosmological argument. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe itself began to exist and thus must have a cause, which many argue is God.
So the good old cosmological argument. Knew this one was going to be here. Not surprised that it's near the top of the list. You know, a lot of Christians are probably going to argue something along the lines of this with you. They might say something about you think the universe was caused from nothing or something like that. I doubt most of them, unless they're in apologetics, are going to actually lay out the cosmological argument. I think one thing we as atheists can get distorted is our perception of who Christians are and what things they say. We're often so terminally online or interact with Christians who are kind of apologetics nerds that we think these things just roll off the tongues of Christians, or maybe we expect them to. And I don't think that happens. But let's do the cosmological argument thing, huh? This one projects our intuition in day-to-day experience back to the beginning of the universe, to a place it really doesn't belong, and that's totally inappropriate. It seems to us that everything has a cause. They added everything that begins to exist, and that's a whole other weird thing. But it seems to us that everything is caused by something else. That's just eyeball level intuition. This is belied by a lot of things such as quantum physics, which I think throw cause and effect out the window on some level. We don't know if the closer you get back to the origin of the universe, this still plays out. So it's just this really weird appeal to intuition. I think you think the universe must have a cause because if you think through an infinite regress, it doesn't make sense. I think Craig used to mathematically argue that, William Lane Craig, if you don't know who I'm talking about, he used to argue that the universe couldn't be infinite because mathematically a past regress of events would always require another event to happen or something like that. Somehow it doesn't work. But why not apply this to God? Can God have an infinite regress of thoughts? If you just say he's timeless, how does a series of thoughts work out in a way that would be any kind of consciousness as we perceive it without a flow of time? I don't know. That gets a little bit complicated. But basically, again, you're just kicking problems up to God and pretending they're not there. Also, the reason things begin to exist, quote unquote, is that we see physical matter taking shape. So the idea of a thing, I think, is kind of philosophically complicated. I'm not a philosopher, so actual philosophy bros in the comments are probably going to eat me alive over this. But what we call a thing is just a label we put on a certain arrangement of matter. And that matter came from other matter that was arranged another way. And so that thing only begins to exist in the sense that matter changed shape or joined with other matter or something like that until we saw a thing that we recognize exist. To argue from that perpetually happening around us to the entire universe coming to exist ex nihilo out of nothing, that's kind of a non sequitur. So this argument's not only applying day-to-day intuition to a place that doesn't belong, it's making a bit of a leap between two totally different concepts that don't have anything to do with each other. One thing I really like, though, about it is that this is supposed to be an infallible argument. This argument's completely unbreakable. It gets you straight to God. But one thing we all know about the Kalam is it doesn't argue to God. It just argues to the universe having a cause. And then Christians kind of yada, yada, yada their way through maybe some additional arguments to just that cause being God. What I love is that this list of, again, infallible arguments is that it just says, this argument leads to a cause, and some Christians argue that cause is God. It just skips past the entire argument. So I said that I kind of expected this argument to be near the end. What's kind of interesting is that this argument isn't at the end. I would think a lot of people would put the Kalam, or if not the Kalam, maybe the design argument at the top. So I'm kind of curious. I'm racking my brain looking through all these old arguments and trying to think what might be number one if it's not the Kalam or design or moral argument or one of these ones we've seen already. So I guess let's see what they came up with.
And finally, at number 1, we have the ontological argument.
So it's the ontological argument, huh? I would not have seen that coming. That is really, really, really weird. It's a weird, dumb argument, but it doesn't get a lot of love for Christians. We'll get into that later. Let's just see it play out first. Let's see what they say about the ontological argument.
This philosophical reasoning states that if we can conceive of a greatest possible being, then it must exist in reality. This argument, while complex, is a cornerstone of many theological discussions.
Yeah, I guess the ontological argument is complex. I'll give it that. But it's not just complex, it's absolute horseshit, even by apologetic standards. I don't know. I'm not sure what I'm going to say about this. I'm a little thrown for a loop by the fact that they included it here. Ontological argument's not super popular. I know that a lot of the big egg-headed apologists are going to bring it up from time to time. But I don't even see it a lot from professional apologists or terminally online apologists. And I think it's just because it's bad and dumb, and it doesn't really have a lot of mass appeal. I don't think it works even in their minds, and it's definitely not something you can communicate to the average Christian. The core idea is just brazenly stupid, and we'll get to that in a second. But in order to cover up how stupid it is, they just, create these meandering, complicated strings of wording. Basically, they take a core dumb idea and through complicated strings of logic, overly wordy explanations, make it hard to follow, basically. And because it's so hard to follow and esoteric, it just doesn't do anything for a Christian. They have no idea what in the world you're talking about when you try to lay out the ontological argument. It's hard because any apologetic needs to sound smart, but it needs to be accessible because this is meant for mass audiences. This is meant to appeal to the average person on the street. This isn't like, high-minded science or anything. You're trying to make a rationalization for God, and it needs to work for a normal person, a normal Christian. So the cosmological argument, for example, it has a few things that appeals to the average person. Everything that exists has a cause. When you say that, somebody knows what it means, and you can reason your way to the universe having a cause in a way that most people can follow to some extent. They can at least get the gist of it. The ontological argument, I don't know, it's completely incomprehensible. I had trouble getting it. I don't think I have huge reading comprehension issues. I can usually get my head around something if I study it and give it some time. Ontological argument was one of the hardest ones for me to get my head around. I think I more or less get it now, but even then it's a little weird and obscure. All I can do is get to the core idea, and that is that basically when it comes down to it, this argument is saying God exists because you can imagine him. And it's a very poor argument. I remember once when I was in high school, I went to Christian school, and the pastor came in and talked to us about arguments for God one day in our Bible class. And one of my friends raised his hand and asked about the ontological argument, tried to explain it, and the pastor just kind of shrugged it off and said it was dumb. It's not consequential. I don't think you're ever going to encounter a Christian who brings up the ontological argument. But yeah, it is as simple as God's real because you can imagine he exists. Or you can imagine the concept of God, therefore he must exist. So, puzzling number one. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, to avoid sounding like I'm just being flippant by saying, God exists because you imagine he exists, I want to cut in after the fact and spend a little more time on this. Because unlike a lot of the other arguments, I think this one might be a little unfamiliar to the average person, so maybe it's worth going over. If it's not and you think this is boring, just skip ahead to the time you see on screen now. To break it down, we're going to look at an early formulation by Anselm of Canterbury, who I think is credited with coming up with this whole thing. By definition, God is a being than which none greater can be imagined. A being that necessarily exists in reality is greater than a being that does not necessarily exist. Thus, by definition, if God exists as an idea in the mind but does not necessarily exist in reality, then we can imagine something that is greater than God. But we cannot imagine something that is greater than God. Thus, if God exists in the mind as an idea, then God necessarily exists in reality. God exists in the mind as an idea, therefore God necessarily exists in reality. This leans heavily on elaborate wordplay, but you can cut through most of it by pointing out that it implicitly assumes God exists in its premises. It defines God as being as great as anything that can be imagined. But this gets you literally nowhere. Like you can declare that the word God describes something so great that we can't imagine anything greater, but until you demonstrate such a thing exists, you might just be using the word God to describe traits you made up. Like seriously, the fifth stage in this argument just asserts that God actually is what a person imagines him to be. It's kind of nonsense. For example, I could say, by definition, the best possible army has invincible soldiers and could instantly destroy any other army. But then if I argued from this premise, thus by definition such an army would conquer the world, therefore the world has been conquered by the best possible army, I'd be building lines of reasoning on something I'd made up. Basically playing a theoretical scenario through to its conclusion based on the possibility of something's existence. It becomes a huge leap from that scenario to asserting anything about reality, right? But that's what the ontological argument does. It proposes the possibility that something exists that's as great as anything we can imagine, then reasons that if this thing had the traits that you proposed it has, then it must exist. And I guess that's fine if you want to discuss that kind of being in theory, just kind of sit around and philosophize about it. But arguing that such a thing actually exists is just entirely circular. Because to actually have those traits, it must exist in the first place, right? So it's basically reasoning from the existence of God to God's existence. It also, yes, is saying that God exists because you can imagine him, but it's doing so using enough needlessly complicated steps to obscure the fact that it's saying something that's stupid. Now, I should add a couple things just to be fair. First, from what I understand, Anselm of Canterbury didn't consider this an argument for God, just a mental exercise to help him think about God. Also, there are many different formulations of this argument, culminating with William Lane Craig's version that involves language about God existing in our world if he existed in other worlds or something. But it's all basically if you can imagine God, he exists, just packaged in different strings of needlessly complex words. Anyway, I guess let's wrap this thing up now.
These are just some of the many arguments and proofs that people present for the existence of God.
Yeah, if you still had any question whether this was being read by an AI, let's go back and listen to how he says these are just some of the many arguments and proofs that people present for the existence of God.
These are just some of the many arguments and proofs that people present for the existence of God.
Cool, right? And I know it's far from the only thing it articulated incorrectly, but geez.
Whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in between, exploring these ideas can be a deeply enriching experience.
Yeah, those are some of the many arguments. In the sense of all the arguments I've heard, those are some of them. I don't know. They were all pretty mundane and boring. So I hope I wasn't just wasting your time with this. But one thing that's interesting is the fact that we probably were able to predict every single argument on this list. I don't know that I would have predicted ontological at the end. And I don't know I would have predicted that the design argument would have come up 3 times. Even though in hindsight it kind of makes sense, there are different iterations of that. Almost surprised it wasn't 4 times and the watchmaker wasn't added in as a separate one. But what can you do? If there's something this tells us, it's that Christians don't have a lot of original arguments. And maybe as we look to what we do with this time we spend being terminally online in these theist debates, as we look to how we take that into the world, I think one thing this might have shown me is consider what kinds of things Christians are going to say and maybe try to take all this stuff you've learned and think about how you could boil it down into a parsimonious, respectful response that would work in day-to-day conversation. What could you have in your back pocket that you could whip out that would be constructive, that wouldn't be degrading to the person you're speaking to, and that is kind of immediately accessible without you just expounding on all this stuff and needing to pull out, notes and references and outlines and turn it into a bigger argument than it's meant to be. One of the weaknesses of, I would say, an atheist perspective or even secular perspective, even just a skeptical or secular or maybe progressive answer to anything in general, is it's going to be more complex than what somebody can just whip off the top of their head. Like, it's easy to say atheists have killed more people than anyone else in history. You can whip that off real quick. It's easy to say there's no basis for morality without God. Someone could just whip that out at the Thanksgiving dinner table real quick and just make it an offhand remark and everybody laughs. If you as the atheist just start being like, well, actually, these and these stats about, Stalin versus other people in Christian history, it turns into what seems like an inappropriate level of conversation, or you're fixating on a really long conversation about something that should have just been a quip. So I don't know. I think maybe it would be helpful for more thought to be put into, if you just encounter these off the cuff, what are you ready to say? And how can you do it in a way that seems conversationally appropriate? Maybe directing the person to more conversation at a later time. Maybe just having some version of that quip ready just to, quip is a hard word because you don't want to just sound smart alecky, but what can you say that lends some credibility without instantly convincing people to your perspective and gets them to think that maybe this whole narrative they've been fed about how ridiculous atheists are isn't as straightforward as they thought. So, I don't know. Hope this gives you something interesting to think about in the face of these what did they call them? Infallible arguments for God. And that's the kind of bravado you expect. But have a good day. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope this was interesting. Welcome to our channel. Today we're charging straight into the most profound question you could ever ask. Does a specific supernatural thing exist? In this case, God. Some people think he exists and others do not. But there are a lot of reasons to think he does instead of does not. So here are the top 10 indestructible proofs that God exists. At number 10, we have the fine-tuning argument. Scientists all around the world universally agree that the universe has the conditions needed to support the kind of life that managed to survive under those conditions. If the universe were different than it is, then the life that survived in it wouldn't be able to survive in it anymore. How could this possibly be unless a supernatural being was turning little knobs to make the universe exactly like it is? Coming in at number 9, we have the complexity of life. Life seems complex to me. I mean, DNA has not just a single helix, but a double helix. Did you know that? Double helix. We're talking a full 2 helixes. And cells literally function. Since this seems way too complicated to have randomly fallen out of a bucket onto the floor, the obvious conclusion is therefore God. Because thinking things I see as complex came about through natural processes I don't personally understand is a significant leap. Assuming they must be the design of a supernatural mind with no body and in fact no substance whatsoever is not a leap at all. It's just how things obviously are. Yeah, get used to it, nerds. Number 8 is the moral argument. The fact that we as humans generally feel good when those around us are happy and feel bad when we do something to hurt them might be explained by the fact that we as a species have an instinct toward empathy toward each other. But I don't think so. What, you think our nature is just an indication of who we are or something? I think we need an eternal ethereal mind to explain why the Earth isn't covered by successful civilizations full of people who run around murdering each other. After all, our instincts towards certain behaviors can be metaphorically described as a law, so how can we explain these instincts without tracing that metaphor back to the point that someone wrote that law? Number 7, we have the argument from consciousness. We are conscious, and that feels mysterious to us. Whoa, dude, like what's going on? Thus, we have to throw God right into that gap in our knowledge and reason the only way there could be consciousness is that it was made by another consciousness that we'll just decide isn't mysterious at all. Nope, no reason to explain the consciousness of God with another consciousness. We just need God to explain our consciousness. Number 6 is the historical evidence for Jesus Christ. Christians wrote stories saying Jesus was raised from the dead, and they were copied like a ton of times. Did you know that? Just so many times. Please don't ask when or by who. Those same Christians who wrote those stories also wrote stories about how his followers' lives were transformed, and Christianity impacted the world after it became powerful and colonized everybody. That means that Jesus was probably a god. At number 5, fulfilled prophecies. A lot of things said in the Bible later came true. No, trust me, a lot of them did. Prophecy. Number 4 is the argument from design, which we've not covered twice already. The fact that you personally perceive things as complex or pretty means that a supernatural disembodied mind exists. At number 3, personal experiences of the divine. The world is just filthy with paranormal phenomena that people swear to up and down based on personal anecdotes. This includes people who are abducted by UFOs or haunted by ghosts, but it also includes people who believe in God. The fact that people all around the world have these anecdotes about different gods does not suggest that most of them are wrong because they contradict each other. It suggests they're all just a teensy bit right. At least in the broad strokes. About God. Good job almost going to heaven, everybody. Number 2 is the cosmological argument. Because you can't say cosmological without logical, you also can't say it without cosmo. all day long, throughout your entire life, you've noticed that every arrangement of matter you label as a thing began to exist in the sense that it came from a previous arrangement of matter. And since it's always super scientific to assume that everything you perceive in your immediate surroundings is how things work everywhere in the universe on every level, we can extrapolate that the universe began to exist in the totally unrelated sense of popping into existence from no matter at all. Also, some people think this causes God. And at number 1, we have the ontological argument. Wait, seriously, you fuckers put this at number 1? Alright, whatever. God must exist because you can imagine him, and I've personally decided that the word God means something as great as you can possibly imagine. This argument, while complex, is a cornerstone of many theological discussions, even though the person who first formulated it didn't think of it as an argument for God, and even Thomas Aquinas thought it was garbage. Yeah, hot garbage! I hope these indestructible, impenetrable arguments give you something thought-provoking to think about. Like, comment, and subscribe! This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, Daniel Bostedt, Dark Side of Delight Productions, Magnus Holmgren, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.